The tent was empty. The footprints were a trail into nowhere. But it was the forensic reports that finally broke the silence of the Dyatlov Pass. What the doctors found beneath the skin didn't just contradict everything they knew about mountain accidents. It shattered the very logic of survival. We aren't just talking about cold anymore. We are talking about force, trauma, and a physical reality that demands an explanation that, for 60 years, has remained just out of reach. If you are watching this right now, I want to ask you something. How much of history do you think is actually true? Because what you are about to hear was never meant to reach you. These are the classified files, the buried evidence, and the forbidden stories that powerful forces spent decades trying to erase. If you are someone who refuses to accept the official story, you are in the right place. Subscribe to the Dark History Files and join thousands of truth seekers uncovering what history tried to hide. Welcome back. This is the Dark History Files, and today we expose a truth that was never meant to be told. Below the damaged tent, the snow preserved one of the most remarkable collections of evidence in the entire Dyatlov investigation. A line of footprints descended the open slope toward the distant forest, crossing the mountainside in a loose but recognizable path. Some impressions belonged to bare feet, others to socks or a single felt boot. They varied in depth and clarity, yet together they suggested movement by several members of the group. The frozen hillside had quietly recorded their departure before later weather gradually erased much of the trail. To the search teams, these tracks offered an unusual experience. Each footprint seemed to carry the silent presence of a person who had crossed the snow only weeks before. Investigators followed the line step by step through the cold air, measuring distances and observing subtle details left behind in the frozen surface. The wind occasionally softened parts of the trail, while other impressions remained surprisingly distinct. Walking beside those fading marks must have felt like following voices that had almost disappeared, leaving only brief traces of their passing. As the footprints continued downhill, an unexpected pattern slowly became visible. The spacing between many of the impressions appeared measured rather than frantic. Instead of scattering in every direction, the trail maintained a general course toward the tree line. Some individuals seemed to walk close together before the tracks gradually spread apart across uneven ground. The evidence suggested movement that unfolded over time rather than a single chaotic rush. Each new observation quietly challenged assumptions that might have seemed obvious before the tracks were carefully examined. These footprints remained deeply unsettling because they seemed to speak with two different voices at once. They clearly confirmed that the hikers left the tent and traveled toward the forest. Beyond that simple fact, certainty begins to fade. The tracks hint at purpose while refusing to explain it. They appear calm, yet they end in one of history's greatest mysteries. Every step preserved in the snow brings us physically closer to what happened, while at the same time carrying us further away from understanding why those steps were taken in the first place. From the earliest days of the investigation, the footprints became one of the strongest pieces of physical evidence because they could be observed directly rather than imagined. Searchers documented their direction, spacing, and condition before changing weather gradually erased many of the finer details. Although not every print survived with equal clarity, enough remained to establish a general route leading from the tent toward the forest below. Unlike later theories built upon interpretation, these marks in the snow represented something tangible. They recorded movement that had truly taken place across the mountainside during that winter night. One detail attracted immediate attention. The footprints did not suggest that everyone wore full winter clothing when leaving the tent. Some impressions appeared to have been made by bare feet pressing directly into the snow. Others indicated socks or lightweight footwear rather than heavy winter boots. This observation created an immediate contradiction. The hikers were highly experienced and understood the dangers of extreme cold better than most people. Choosing to cross an exposed slope without proper footwear would have violated the practical habits that had guided every earlier stage of their expedition. The direction of travel also raises quiet but important questions. The trail led downhill toward the shelter of the forest rather than continuing across higher ground or circling back around the slope. From a practical perspective, the trees offered firewood, some protection from the wind, and possible shelter if remaining at the tent no longer seemed safe. At first glance, this decision appears logical, yet it also meant leaving behind warm clothing, sleeping bags, food, and nearly every resource needed to survive the freezing night. The footprints therefore describe a choice that feels understandable in one sense, while deeply puzzling in another. Investigators also noticed what the trail did not reveal. There were no obvious signs of prolonged struggle surrounding the line of tracks. The snow did not preserve evidence of people chasing one another across the slope or fighting near the tent. While weather and time may have erased smaller details, the broader pattern remained surprisingly orderly. This absence of visible chaos has challenged generations of researchers because it sits uneasily beside the urgency implied by cutting open the tent from the inside. The two pieces of evidence seem connected, yet they tell noticeably different stories. The longer these footprints are examined, the more they resist simple conclusions. Every interpretation explains part of the evidence, while leaving another part unanswered. Calm movement conflicts with apparent urgency. Limited clothing conflicts with experienced judgment. A deliberate route toward the forest conflicts with abandoning essential equipment. Rather than pointing toward one clear explanation, the trail quietly reveals how several ordinary observations can combine to produce an extraordinary mystery, one that continues to invite careful examination instead of easy answers. The snow itself played an unexpected role in preserving this mystery. Fresh winter snow is rarely a perfect record of human movement. Wind reshapes its surface, sunlight hardens exposed areas, and drifting layers gradually soften sharp impressions. Yet during the weeks before the search party arrived, certain conditions allowed portions of the hikers' route to remain visible long enough for investigators to study them. The mountain became an unwilling witness, holding fragments of the story just long enough to be discovered before nature slowly reclaimed them. Forensic specialists later understood that footprints reveal more than direction alone. The depth of an impression can suggest weight distribution. The distance between steps may hint at speed or physical condition. Groups of tracks can indicate whether people stayed together or gradually separated. These observations are valuable, but they also carry limits. Snow changes constantly after a footprint is made, making exact conclusions difficult. Every measurement therefore requires careful judgment, balancing what the evidence clearly shows against what changing weather may have quietly altered over time. One of the more intriguing aspects of the trail is the relationship between individual tracks. Reports from the investigation suggest that several footprints overlapped, while others gradually drifted apart as the descent continued. This pattern resembles people traveling together rather than a collection of individuals fleeing independently in random directions. If that interpretation is correct, the group may have remained organized during at least the early part of their movement away from the tent. Such cooperation feels consistent with everything known about their experience, yet it raises another difficult question. If they remained together, what shared understanding guided them into the darkness? The trail also carries an important emotional quality that is easy to overlook. Every footprint represents a living person making one deliberate step after another. These are not abstract pieces of evidence collected inside a laboratory. They mark real moments when tired hikers crossed freezing snow beneath a winter sky, unaware that their final journey would one day be examined in extraordinary detail. The physical distance between one footprint and the next appears small, but together they measure the beginning of a path that history would remember far longer than anyone walking it could have imagined. As years passed, many discussions focused on dramatic theories while giving less attention to the quiet discipline required to interpret the footprints themselves. The tracks do not support sensational conclusions on their own. Instead, they invite patience. They ask observers to notice sequence, spacing, direction, and context before reaching judgment. In that sense, the footprints continue to teach the same lesson they offered investigators from the very beginning. Evidence often speaks softly, and understanding depends upon listening carefully before deciding what the silence truly means. As investigators compared the footprints with the condition of the tent, a subtle contradiction became increasingly difficult to ignore. The damaged canvas suggested urgency, yet the tracks outside often appeared controlled. If an immediate threat had forced the hikers to leave within seconds, why did so many footprints resemble the pace of ordinary walking rather than desperate flight? On the other hand, if they had enough composure to move carefully down the slope, what circumstance convinced them to abandon the shelter that had protected them only moments before? The evidence quietly pulled in two different directions at once. This contradiction has shaped nearly every major theory proposed over the decades. Those who favor an avalanche point to the need for rapid evacuation. Others argue that unusual weather, violent winds, or a perceived danger near the campsite might explain the decision to leave. Some researchers suggest the group expected to return after a short time, believing the tent would remain accessible once the immediate problem had passed. Each explanation attempts to connect the damaged shelter with the measured footprints. None succeeds without leaving at least one important question unresolved. The spacing between the tracks adds another layer of quiet complexity. Several impressions indicate that individuals remained close enough to one another to preserve the sense of a group rather than a scattered collection of frightened people. This detail reflects the cooperative behavior seen throughout the expedition. Even during uncertainty, they may have continued making decisions together instead of acting independently. If that interpretation is correct, then leadership, communication, and shared judgment likely continued after they left the tent. Whatever influenced their actions affected not just one person, but the entire group. Another overlooked detail concerns the route itself. The hikers did not wander aimlessly across the open mountainside. Their direction consistently favored the distant forest, the nearest location offering protection from the wind and access to firewood. That decision reveals practical thinking under difficult circumstances. It suggests they were not abandoning reason altogether. Instead, they may have been balancing immediate risk against long-term survival, choosing the option that appeared most sensible based on whatever they believed was happening at that moment. Their actions therefore carry signs of both urgency and deliberate judgment. Perhaps this is why the footprints continue to resist simple interpretation. They refuse to fit neatly inside any single explanation. Every measured step encourages one conclusion before another detail quietly interrupts it. Rather than solving the mystery, the trail deepens it by revealing thoughtful behavior where many expected panic. The snow preserved movement, but not conversation. It recorded direction, but not intention. Between those missing pieces lies one of the most difficult questions in the entire Dyatlov case, waiting patiently for an answer that has never fully arrived. Eventually, The visible trail began to fade beneath changing snow and uneven terrain. The footprints that had guided investigators across the open slope gradually became less distinct as they approached the edge of the forest. Nature reclaimed the final sections of the route, leaving search teams to rely on the discoveries that waited among the trees. The mountain offered enough evidence to establish the direction of travel, but not enough to preserve every step. As the tracks disappeared, certainty faded with them, giving way to a new collection of unanswered questions. This transition marks an important turning point in the Dyatlov story. Up to this point, investigators could follow physical evidence in a nearly continuous sequence. The damaged tent led to the footprints. The footprints led toward the forest. Beyond that, the mystery became increasingly fragmented. Individual discoveries appeared in separate locations, each revealing part of the night's events without explaining how those moments connected. The orderly trail gave way to scattered clues that demanded careful reconstruction rather than direct observation. For decades, researchers have returned to those footprints because they represent one of the few pieces of evidence that captures the hikers while they were still moving together. Before the group became separated by distance and circumstance, the snow briefly recorded their shared journey away from the tent. That fleeting record reminds us that the mystery was not created by isolated actions alone. It unfolded through a sequence of choices made by companions who had trusted one another throughout the expedition. The footprints preserve the beginning of that sequence, even if they cannot reveal its ending. Modern discussions often focus on dramatic possibilities, searching for hidden forces or extraordinary events that might explain every detail at once. Yet the footprints encourage a different approach. They reward careful observation over dramatic speculation. They ask us to notice practical decisions, subtle patterns, and small contradictions before embracing larger conclusions. In many ways, they represent the quiet heart of the entire investigation. They are neither sensational nor mysterious by themselves. Their power comes from how ordinary they appear while leading toward an outcome that remains profoundly difficult to explain. As we leave the footprints behind, the investigation follows the same path taken by the hikers that winter night. The snow has carried us away from the shelter and toward the waiting forest below. There, beneath towering cedar branches and among scattered traces of desperate survival, another chapter begins. The calm trail across the mountainside will soon give way to evidence of fire, struggle, and difficult choices. What appeared orderly on the open slope will become far more complex beneath the trees, where the mountain guarded the next part of its secret. The footprints across the slope told us they left in a hurry. But what they found in the forest, the fire, the cedar, the makeshift shelter, reveals that the struggle didn't end with a run for safety. It was a long, cold battle for survival, staged by agonizing stage. The forest below the open slope presented a landscape unlike the exposed mountainside above. Tall cedar and spruce trees interrupted the wind, creating pockets of shelter beneath heavy branches covered with snow. At the base of one large cedar, investigators discovered the remains of a small fire surrounded by broken twigs, scattered clothing, and signs of human activity. Nearby, the snow preserved an arrangement of evidence that appeared unrelated at first glance, yet every object belonged to the same extraordinary night. Standing beneath the trees would have felt very different from standing on the open mountain. The dense branches softened the force of the wind, while the smell of pine mixed with smoke from a fire that had long since faded into cold ash. Snow settled unevenly across roots and fallen branches instead of drifting freely over open ground. Every step through the forest produced different sounds from those heard on the slope above. replacing wide, empty echoes with quieter movements carried between the trunks. As investigators moved through the area, the evidence no longer followed a single continuous line. Instead, discoveries appeared in separate places, each revealing another fragment of the night's events. The fire rested beneath the cedar. Clothing lay scattered nearby. Broken branches reached several meters above the ground, suggesting someone had climbed into the tree. Farther away, additional bodies would later be found in different locations, turning one mystery into several connected scenes spread across the forest floor. The forest changes the way this story is understood. On the mountainside, the footprints suggested a group moving together toward a shared destination. Beneath the trees, that sense of unity begins to dissolve into individual moments and difficult choices. The evidence no longer speaks with one clear voice. Instead, it offers quiet fragments waiting to be connected. Every branch, every footprint, and every abandoned piece of clothing carries part of the story, yet none reveals the whole picture on its own. The small fire beneath the cedar quickly became one of the most important discoveries in the forest. Its remains showed that at least some members of the group had successfully gathered wood and managed to ignite a flame despite freezing temperatures. Charred branches, burned twigs, and patches of ash indicated that the fire had burned long enough to consume available fuel before gradually fading. It was not a large blaze capable of warming many people across a wide area. Instead, it appears to have been a practical attempt to preserve life with the limited resources available after leaving the tent. The location of the fire also reveals thoughtful decision-making. Beneath the broad cedar branches, the hikers found partial protection from the strongest winds that swept across the open slope above. Nearby trees provided small branches that could be broken for kindling, while thicker wood offered fuel capable of burning longer. In such conditions, even a modest fire could provide precious warmth to frozen hands and create enough light for companions to remain together in the darkness. The choice of this location reflects survival knowledge rather than random movement through the forest. Perhaps the most intriguing evidence surrounded the cedar itself. Investigators observed broken branches extending several meters above the ground. Some appeared freshly damaged, suggesting they had been snapped during the night rather than by older storms or natural decay. This unusual detail has inspired many interpretations. One possibility is that someone climbed the tree to gain a better view of the mountainside and the distant campsite. Another is that branches were deliberately broken to gather additional fuel for the fire. Both explanations carry practical logic, and neither completely excludes the other. Near the fire, the first two bodies were eventually discovered. Their position close to the extinguished flames suggests they had remained at this location until the end of their strength. Clothing on the bodies indicated they were not fully dressed for the extreme conditions, reinforcing the evidence already found at the abandoned tent. Yet despite limited protection from the cold, they had still managed to build a fire, demonstrating determination and practical effort rather than helplessness. Their actions point toward people actively trying to survive instead of surrendering to circumstance. The cedar therefore becomes far more than a simple landmark within the investigation. It represents the first place where the hikers appear to have adapted to a new reality after leaving the tent. Here, ordinary expedition routines gave way to emergency survival decisions. Fire replaced shelter. Nearby branches replaced stored equipment. Every action reflected the immediate demands of the environment rather than the careful planning that had guided the expedition only a short time earlier. The forest was quietly revealing a second chapter, one shaped by improvisation instead of preparation. Beyond the cedar, investigators encountered another pattern that slowly reshaped their understanding of the night. The bodies were not discovered together in one location. Instead, they appeared at different distances between the forest and the abandoned tent, while others remained hidden beneath deep snow for several more months. This distribution suggested that the events after leaving the campsite did not unfold in a single moment. Instead, the evidence pointed toward a sequence of separate stages, each leaving its own quiet trace across the landscape. 3 members of the group were eventually found on the slope leading back toward the tent. Their positions have often been interpreted as an attempt to return to the shelter after reaching the forest. Whether that conclusion is entirely correct remains uncertain, yet the direction of their location raises an important possibility. If they truly began climbing back uphill, then something may have changed after the fire was built. Their priorities could have shifted, or they may have believed conditions near the campsite had become safer than before. The mountain offers no explanation, only the possibilities suggested by their final positions. Months later, after snow began to melt, the remaining 4 hikers were discovered in a nearby ravine covered beneath several meters of accumulated snow. This location differed noticeably from every earlier discovery. The terrain offered deeper shelter from the wind, yet it also concealed the bodies far more effectively than the open slope or the cedar tree. Nearby investigators found signs of a makeshift shelter constructed from branches and natural materials. This simple structure suggests that at least part of the group continued making organized survival decisions even after reaching the forest. Clothing found among these later discoveries introduced another important detail. Some members wore additional garments that originally belonged to companions discovered earlier near the fire. This observation strongly suggests that clothing had been redistributed after the first deaths, allowing surviving hikers to increase their protection against the cold. Rather than revealing disorder, this evidence reflects practical judgment under desperate circumstances. They continued solving immediate problems with the limited resources available, adapting as conditions changed around them. When viewed together, these discoveries transformed the forest into something resembling a timeline rather than a single location. The fire beneath the cedar marks one chapter. The attempts to return toward the tent may represent another. The hidden ravine and improvised shelter introduce yet another stage in the unfolding story. Instead of one unexplained event ending everything at once, the evidence quietly suggests a longer struggle shaped by changing decisions, shifting priorities, and repeated efforts to survive. The forest preserves these moments not as one mystery, but as several connected pieces waiting to be understood together. The scattered clothing discovered throughout the forest has often received less attention than the injuries or the damaged tent, yet it offers an important glimpse into the hikers' decisions. Gloves, hats, jackets, and smaller personal items appeared in different locations rather than remaining with their original owners. At first, this arrangement seemed confusing. Over time, investigators recognized that these garments were not random clues. They reflected practical choices made during an increasingly difficult struggle against extreme cold, where every available layer could mean the difference between endurance and exposure. One particularly revealing pattern involved clothing that had been removed from companions who had already died. Modern readers sometimes find this detail unsettling. Yet within a survival situation, it represents a logical response rather than an act of disrespect. Experienced hikers understood that preserving the lives of those still breathing required immediate action. Warm clothing could no longer help someone who had already passed away, but it might extend another person's chances of survival. This quiet redistribution speaks not of panic, but of difficult decisions made with remarkable clarity under impossible conditions. The forest also encourages a different understanding of time. At the campsite, Many clues suggest a single moment of sudden change. Among the trees, the evidence unfolds more gradually. A fire is built, branches are broken, clothing is shared. Some members move toward the slope, while others remain near the ravine. These discoveries suggest that the group continued making choices over a period of time rather than experiencing one immediate catastrophe. The mystery, therefore, becomes less about one dramatic event and more about a sequence of unfolding circumstances that steadily narrowed their options. Even the natural features of the forest influenced those choices. Dense trees offered shelter from the strongest winds, but reduced visibility toward the mountainside. Deep snow concealed uneven ground beneath the surface, making movement slower and more demanding. The ravine provided protection from exposure, yet it also created hidden dangers beneath drifting snow and unstable terrain. Every location offered one advantage while introducing another challenge. Survival depended upon balancing these competing conditions with limited strength and rapidly diminishing resources. Taken together, these quiet clues reveal something deeply human. The hikers did not stop thinking after leaving the tent. They continued adapting, cooperating, and making practical decisions as circumstances evolved around them. Their actions inside the forest reflect experience carried into an emergency rather than confusion replacing judgment. Every borrowed coat, broken branch, and chosen shelter tells the same story. Even in the face of overwhelming hardship, they continued trying to solve problems one decision at a time. That determination becomes one of the most powerful voices preserved within the silent forest itself. By the time investigators completed their work in the forest, a very different picture had emerged from the one suggested by the abandoned tent alone. The campsite had captured the final moments before the hikers left their shelter. The forest revealed what happened afterward, not through a single dramatic discovery, but through many small pieces of evidence spread across different locations. Each finding added another layer to the story, showing that the night unfolded through several distinct stages rather than one sudden, unexplained event. The cedar tree, the fading fire, the scattered clothing, the route back toward the slope, and the hidden ravine all appear connected by a quiet thread of human decision-making. None of these places existed in isolation. Together, they suggest movement, adaptation, and repeated attempts to respond to changing circumstances. Even without written records from those final hours, the surviving evidence points toward people who continued evaluating their situation instead of surrendering to it. Every new location marks another chapter in an unfolding sequence of choices shaped by the harsh realities of the winter landscape. Yet the forest also introduces mysteries that no careful reconstruction has fully resolved. Why did some members remain near the fire while others moved elsewhere? What prompted the apparent attempt to return toward the tent? Why was the shelter in the ravine chosen, and what finally happened there? These questions arise naturally from the evidence itself rather than from speculation. The clues encourage thoughtful examination, but they stop just short of providing complete answers. In that narrow space between observation and certainty, the Dyatlov mystery has continued to grow across generations. Perhaps this is the forest's greatest contribution to the investigation. It transforms the story from a single unexplained departure into a series of connected human experiences. The hikers emerge not as passive victims carried through mysterious events, but as capable individuals making practical decisions under extraordinary pressure. Their final hours appear filled with effort, cooperation, and adaptation, even as their options steadily diminished. The forest preserves those efforts with remarkable restraint, allowing small details to speak more clearly than dramatic theories ever could. As the search moves beyond the trees, another layer of the mystery begins to emerge. The positions of the bodies and the traces of survival explain part of the story, but they do not explain the injuries that would later astonish investigators. Broken ribs, severe internal trauma, and other unexpected findings would introduce an entirely different set of questions. The quiet clues of the forest have shown us how the night unfolded across the landscape. The next chapter asks what happened to the people themselves, where the evidence becomes even more difficult to understand. Survival is one thing, but the injuries found on the victims suggest something else entirely. The forest holds the story of their movements, but the medical reports hold the story of their final, inexplicable trauma. We move now from the struggle for air and warmth to the stark, clinical evidence left in the aftermath. When forensic examinations began, investigators encountered injuries unlike those normally associated with exposure to cold alone. Several members of the expedition showed fractures to the chest, severe damage to the skull, and other significant internal trauma. At the same time, parts of the skin displayed comparatively limited external injury. This unusual combination immediately separated the Dyatlov case from ordinary mountain accidents. The physical evidence suggested powerful forces had acted upon some of the victims, yet the visible condition of the bodies did not always appear to match the severity beneath the surface. Reading the medical reports creates an experience very different from examining the campsite or the forest. Instead of footprints and broken branches, the investigation enters the quiet language of anatomy. Every observation describes the human body responding to extraordinary stress. Bones, tissue, and organs become silent witnesses, recording impacts that could not speak for themselves. The reports are clinical in tone, yet beneath that careful wording lies an unmistakable sense that the doctors were documenting findings they did not expect to encounter in an isolated winter expedition. As specialists compared one examination with another, important differences between the victims gradually emerged. Some bodies showed injuries largely consistent with prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures. Others revealed far more serious trauma involving the chest or head. This uneven pattern suggested that the group had not experienced exactly the same sequence of events. Their final hours may have unfolded under changing circumstances, affecting individuals in different ways. The evidence quietly shifted the investigation away from searching for one uniform explanation toward considering several connected events instead. These medical findings continue to shape the mystery because they resist comfortable certainty. They neither confirm a single dramatic theory nor quietly disappear into ordinary explanations. Instead, they occupy a difficult middle ground where evidence feels both clear and incomplete at the same time. The injuries undeniably tell part of the story, yet they refuse to reveal the full sequence that produced them. In that silence, the human body becomes one of the most important witnesses in the entire Dyatlov investigation, preserving answers that remain frustratingly unfinished. Among the most discussed findings were the severe chest injuries suffered by 2 members of the expedition. Medical examinations described multiple broken ribs accompanied by extensive internal damage. Investigators noted that the force required to produce such injuries appeared considerable. Yet unlike many high-impact accidents, the surrounding skin displayed relatively few large open wounds. This contrast immediately attracted attention because it challenged familiar expectations about how the human body usually responds to powerful physical trauma. The reports described the injuries with careful precision while offering only limited certainty about their exact cause. Another member was found with a significant skull fracture. Once again, the medical evidence raised difficult questions rather than simple conclusions. The injury suggested a substantial impact. Yet investigators struggled to identify a clear object or location capable of producing it with confidence. No obvious signs of prolonged violent struggle accompanied the finding, and no straightforward sequence comfortably explained how such trauma fit alongside the other evidence already collected from the mountainside and forest. Each medical observation appeared convincing by itself, while remaining difficult to integrate into a single complete narrative. The official forensic examinations also emphasized an important distinction between fatal injuries and injuries that occurred after death. Specialists attempted to determine whether damage had been sustained while the victims were still alive, using internal bleeding and tissue response as critical indicators. In several cases, the reports concluded that major trauma had indeed occurred before death rather than resulting from later environmental changes. This conclusion carried significant weight because it established that at least some injuries belonged directly to the events of that winter night rather than to months of exposure beneath snow. For investigators, these findings gradually transformed the medical examination from a supporting element into one of the central pillars of the entire case. Physical injuries could not easily be dismissed as secondary details because they shaped every attempt to reconstruct the final hours. Any explanation that ignored the severity of the trauma immediately appeared incomplete. At the same time, explanations focused only on the injuries often struggled to account for the orderly footprints, the abandoned tent, and the evidence of survival efforts within the forest. Each category of evidence seemed to answer one question while creating another. This growing tension between medical science and the broader investigation continues to define the Dyatlov mystery. The injuries provide measurable facts recorded by trained professionals. Their existence is not disputed. What remains uncertain is the precise sequence of events that produced them. Rather than pointing clearly toward one conclusion, the forensic evidence quietly invites continued examination, reminding us that reliable observations do not always lead to simple explanations, especially when every answer must also fit the rest of the remarkable evidence left behind. Among the most widely discussed details in the medical reports were the missing soft tissues found on several of the victims. Portions of the face, including areas around the eyes and lips, were absent in some cases, leading to decades of speculation. At first glance, these findings appeared deeply mysterious. However, forensic specialists also recognized that bodies left for extended periods in harsh outdoor environments often undergo complex natural changes. The location of the remains, seasonal conditions, and exposure to animals and flowing water all became important factors when interpreting these observations. The 4 hikers discovered in the ravine had spent several months beneath deep snow before they were recovered. During that time, freezing temperatures preserved many aspects of the bodies, while spring meltwater gradually altered others. Investigators noted that the ravine contained running water beneath the snow, creating environmental conditions quite different from those affecting the victims found earlier on the open slope or near the cedar tree. These differences help explain why the physical condition of the bodies varied so noticeably, even though all belonged to the same expedition. Forensic analysis therefore required careful separation between injuries caused during life and changes that occurred afterward. Medical examiners distinguished fractures showing signs of bleeding from tissue changes associated with prolonged exposure after death. This distinction remains essential because combining the two can produce misleading conclusions. Some dramatic features frequently discussed in popular accounts may reflect natural environmental processes rather than direct evidence of what happened during the hikers' final hours. Recognizing that difference allows the investigation to focus more accurately on injuries that truly belong to the unfolding events of that winter night. Another subtle challenge involved the passage of time itself. The first bodies were recovered weeks before the final four emerged from beneath the melting snow. As a result, investigators examined remains that had experienced different environmental histories despite originating from the same incident. This uneven timeline complicated direct comparison between individual cases. Weather, moisture, snow depth, and animal activity affected each recovery site differently, requiring every medical finding to be interpreted within its specific context rather than treated as identical evidence across the entire group. These complexities remind us that forensic science often advances by eliminating possibilities before confirming them. The medical reports do not invite sensational conclusions. Instead, they encourage careful distinction between documented trauma, environmental alteration, and understandable uncertainty. Every observation must be placed within its proper setting before meaningful patterns begin to emerge. In the Dyatlov investigation, that disciplined approach reveals something important. The mystery grows not because the evidence is impossible to understand, but because several different kinds of evidence must be separated with extraordinary care before they can be considered together. As forensic experts reviewed the injuries as a whole, one question quietly rose above many others. What kind of force could produce severe internal damage while leaving comparatively limited external marks on the body? This observation did not suggest that the injuries were impossible. Similar patterns can occur in certain high-energy impacts where pressure is distributed across a broad area rather than concentrated at a single point. Even so, identifying the exact source of such force within the known circumstances of the Dyatlov expedition proved far more difficult than recognizing the injuries themselves. Over the decades, researchers have proposed several natural explanations. A fall into the ravine could expose the body to significant impact against snow-covered rocks hidden beneath the surface. Heavy masses of compacted snow might also generate crushing forces under particular conditions. Others have suggested that movement across uneven terrain during darkness could have contributed to isolated traumatic injuries. Each possibility addresses part of the medical evidence while leaving other observations open to debate. None comfortably resolves every documented finding without introducing additional questions. The diversity of injuries within the group further complicates the picture. Some hikers died primarily from hypothermia with relatively limited traumatic injury. Others experienced major chest or head trauma before death. This uneven distribution suggests that the group may have encountered different hazards after leaving the tent rather than sharing one identical experience from beginning to end. Their final hours could have unfolded through multiple stages, with changing circumstances affecting individuals in different ways according to where they were and what decisions they made along the way. Forensic specialists have often emphasized an important principle that is easy to overlook. Medical evidence identifies what happened to the body, but it does not always reveal the precise circumstances that produced those injuries. A fracture records physical force. It does not identify the surrounding environment, the sequence of events, or the intentions of those involved. Those broader questions require investigators to compare medical findings with terrain, weather, witness testimony, and every other available piece of evidence. The body speaks clearly about trauma, yet it cannot describe the full story by itself. This distinction explains why the Dyatlov injuries remain both informative and frustrating. They are among the strongest pieces of physical evidence in the case, yet they cannot stand alone as a complete explanation. Instead, they function like another section of a larger puzzle. Each fracture, bruise, and medical observation contributes an essential detail, but only when viewed alongside the campsite, the footprints, and the forest discoveries does a broader picture begin to appear. Even then, important spaces remain between the pieces, inviting continued study rather than certainty. By the end of the forensic investigation, the medical evidence had accomplished something unusual. It had narrowed many possibilities while refusing to identify a single unquestioned answer. The examinations confirmed that some members of the expedition died primarily from exposure to the severe cold. Others suffered major traumatic injuries before death. Those conclusions were supported by careful medical observation, yet they described outcomes rather than causes. The reports explained what investigators could measure inside the bodies, but they remained far quieter about the exact chain of events that produced those findings. As later generations revisited the case, the injuries often became the center of dramatic speculation. Extraordinary explanations appeared because the medical evidence seemed difficult to reconcile with the rest of the investigation. Yet the reports themselves remain remarkably restrained. They avoid sensational language and focus instead on observable facts. Broken ribs, skull fractures, tissue damage, and signs of hypothermia are recorded with clinical precision. The mystery grows not from exaggerated claims within the documents, but from the challenge of fitting those carefully documented observations into the wider sequence of events already revealed by the campsite and the forest. Perhaps the most important lesson offered by the forensic evidence is one of patience. Every injury answers a specific question while leaving several others untouched. The reports reveal physical consequences, but they cannot describe conversations, intentions, or changing decisions during the final hours of the expedition. Medical science establishes boundaries for what likely happened to the bodies. It cannot fully reconstruct the human experience that unfolded between the moment the hikers left the tent and the moment their struggle came to an end. That missing space continues to invite thoughtful investigation rather than confident certainty. Viewed alongside every earlier discovery, the injuries become part of a remarkably consistent pattern. The evidence refuses simple storytelling. Calm footprints challenge panic. Organized survival efforts challenge helplessness. Severe trauma challenges ordinary expectations. Each category of evidence appears reliable on its own, yet each also asks to be interpreted alongside every other clue. The investigation therefore becomes less about choosing one favorite explanation and more about respecting the complexity preserved across the mountain, the forest, and the medical reports themselves. The next chapter shifts away from the bodies and toward the people who tried to understand them. Investigators, prosecutors, rescue teams, and later researchers all inherited the same collection of incomplete evidence. Their work would shape the mystery almost as much as the events of that winter night. Missing documents, conflicting statements, and unanswered procedural questions would gradually become mysteries of their own, revealing that sometimes the search for truth continues long after the last footprint has disappeared beneath the snow. The bodies are silent, yet their injuries tell a story that doesn't fit the landscape. We have examined the tent, the trail, the forest, and the anatomy of the tragedy, but the mystery is far from solved. Documents went missing, witnesses were silenced, and the official records left behind more questions than they answered. The final chapter of this enigma isn't just about what happened on the mountain. It's about why the truth was buried for so long. The conclusion of our investigation and the final assessment of this historic mystery is coming. Join us for the final piece of the puzzle, releasing in just 48 hours.